Chapter 3. The Stability-Flexibility Dilemma. Imagine that you are driving to a friend's house when your cell phone buzzes, signaling an incoming text. For most of us, that buzz triggers an urge to check our phone. Of course, the dangers of doing so while driving are also well known. The U.S. Federal Communications Commission has estimated that more than 1,000 people in the U.S. are injured and 9 are killed each day owing to cell phone use while driving. Several states have passed laws banning or severely restricting cell phone use in cars. Almost all ban texting explicitly. Yet, it is also estimated that at any moment during the day, more than 500,000 drivers are using their cell phone or other electronic devices while driving. Yes, some of these people who text while driving may simply not know about the dangers of distracted driving, or worse, they may think themselves capable of handling it. But it is also likely that many people are fully aware of the risks, and yet the buzz of an incoming text is a stimulus they just can't resist. This is likely because those thousands of calls and texts they've received over the years have actually been thousands of little lessons for their brain. They are learning events that have trained their brain to link the buzz of an incoming text with the action of looking at their phone and the social reward it brings. For some people, the reward of checking their phones doesn't even require the buzz of the phone. They have learned to check their various social media sites at regular intervals, whether they are driving, eating dinner, or in a face-to-face conversation with another person. Indeed, social media sites weaponized this reward function when they added the like button. We now check and recheck our posts of vacation pictures and adorable pets with the frequency of a rat pressing a lever for cocaine. To avoid texting while driving, our cognitive control system must override our learned impulse to check the phone. Somehow, we need to use our context, in this case, driving, to change how we usually behave with a buzzing phone. We might outright stop ourselves from looking at the phone, or simply choose to refocus on the road, or ask someone else in the car to check the phone for us. Using a context to choose a less frequent or alternative course of action is the most basic expression of cognitive control. What basic mechanisms in the mind and brain allow us to succeed in cases like this? In this chapter, we will address this question, first discussing the central position of working memory in situations like our driving example. Then, we will discuss how an ancient circuit for motor control was co-opted by the brain to manage working memory, and thereby became the fundamental circuit for cognitive control function. Working memory and control. In a seminal paper published in 1990, John Cohen, Kevin Dunbar, and Jay McClelland reported a simple neural network model that could perform the Stroop task. Recall from Chapter 1 that in the Stroop task, when the ink color of a written word does not match the color named by that word, we have difficulty naming the ink color, usually evident in a slowed response time. Conversely, reading the word does not produce the same difficulty, even when the word and ink color are mismatched. This asymmetry emerges because we have more experience reading words than naming colors, so word reading is more automatic. Thus, we can think of the Stroop task as a laboratory model of the choices we make while driving. As in overriding our compulsion to check our text message, when our context is the color naming task, we must overcome the automatic tendency to read the word in order to name the color instead. We can do it, but it takes us more time. To explain our ability to do this, Cohen, Dunbar, and McClelland proposed the guided activation model. From here on, we'll refer to this model as the CDM model, after its authors. CDM is an example of a theoretical tool called a computational model. Computational models are formal, mathematical expressions of a theory, often in the form of a computer program. They allow scientists to be explicit about the assumptions their theory makes and to verify how well their theory matches the phenomena they seek to explain. CDM is a particular kind of computational model called a neural network model, meaning that its computations are inspired by the kinds of interactions real neurons have with each other. CDM is simpler than the convolutional neural nets that you hear about at places like Google DeepMind, but the basic principles are similar. So, before we can understand how CDM implements cognitive control in the Stroop task, we need to cover a little background on how neural networks like CDM compute. A neural network is made up of simulated neurons that receive input from other active neurons that connect to them. The more input a neuron receives, the more active it will become. The relationship between how much input a neuron receives and how active it is often follows an S-shaped function. This means that when there are small to moderate amounts of input, the neuron won't be very active. But at some point, when the input is great enough, the neuron will rapidly gain activity to a maximum. The more active a neuron is, the greater the input it delivers to target neurons to which it is connected. Once its inputs are great enough, that target neuron passes its input to another target neuron to which it is connected, and so on. The propagation of these inputs from one neuron to the next is how a model like CDM computes. It allows a particular pattern of activity across one set of neurons to reliably and consistently produce a pattern of activity across a set of target neurons. This propagation of activity patterns is akin to what the brain is doing all the time. It is how we go from a pattern of neural activity across our perceptual systems corresponding to, say, an ice cream cone we see, to a pattern of neural activity across our motor system that eats it. Importantly, the strength of the input delivered from one neuron to another will depend not only on activity levels, but also on the strength of their connection. This connection strength is sometimes called a synaptic weight, in reference to the synapses that connect real neurons with each other in the brain. Obviously, the stronger the synaptic weight, the more likely that the sending neuron can elicit high activity in the target neuron. At the scale of the whole network, synaptic weights determine how a particular pattern of activity in one population of neurons will produce a consistent pattern of activity in another population of neurons. In other words, these synaptic weights are how models like CDM store information. Thus, to understand how CDM solves the Stroop task, we need to examine how its various neurons are connected to each other and how their synaptic weights are determined. CDM has 4 basic groupings of neurons called layers. At the bottom is the sensory layer. This layer is the model's rudimentary perceptual system. It has neurons that fire to specific features the model senses in the world. Of course, CDM's simulated world is quite simple. It consists only of the words red and green that appear in the ink colors red or green. So its perceptual system does not need much sophistication to cover every situation it might ever encounter in its world. There are individual neurons for the ink colors red and green, and the words red and green. Each neuron will fire when its feature is sensed. For example, if the model encounters the word green written in red ink, the corresponding neurons for the word green and the ink color red will fire. That pattern of activity across the sensory layer is the model's representation of the word green written in red. At the other end is the response layer. This layer has neurons corresponding to the spoken responses the model could make to seeing a colored word. For this model, there are only two responses one ever makes, either say red or say green. When one of these neurons fires, the model has given the corresponding verbal response. Further, the response units compete with each other, so that both cannot be active at the same time. This makes sense. You can't say red and green simultaneously. Why should we expect the model to do so? Between the sensory and response layers sits an intermediate layer, sometimes called the hidden layer. The hidden layer receives its input from the sensory layer and passes its output to the response layer. Thus, you can think of the propagation of activity from the sensory to the intermediate to the response layer as being a pathway linking a stimulus to a response. In other words, when the model sees the word red and then says red, a specific set of neurons will be active in the sensory, then the intermediate, and then response layer. This specific propagation of neural activity corresponds to the red word response pathway, and it will be different from the green word response pathway or the red ink color response pathway. Indeed, the model will have a separate pathway for each mapping of stimulus feature to response. The hidden layer is needed because without it, the model could not learn to form these separated pathways, such as for either the green word or the green color, but not both. A final critical feature is that these pathways are learned by the model, not programmed by the model builder. That would run afoul of our pesky homunculus problem from Chapter 1. Rather, CDM learns the connection strengths through experience with seeing words and colors and making responses. Learning occurs through a process called backpropagation. On each learning event, the model is shown an input, like the color red, and is allowed to produce an output. Green, the untrained model guesses, for example. The difference between the response it gave and the one it should have given is an error, which can be expressed as a number, a difference between the desired and elicited activity pattern. For the model to learn from this mistake, the programmer adjusts the synaptic strengths along the pathway that produced the response in proportion to the magnitude of this error and their contribution to producing it. This process is repeated over and over again until this error is reduced. From the gradual adjustment of synaptic weights to reduce error, the model can learn how to map each stimulus input to the right response without needing a programmer to set them that way. The model learns and stores the response pathways for each stimulus feature in its connection weights. We now have a simple model that can respond red or green, depending on the color of a word or the color it names. But we are not quite to the Stroop task yet. First, a feature of the Stroop task is the predominance of word reading over color naming. To implement this in the model gets more experience with word reading, similar to the way people do. During its training, the model gets to read a word many more times than it names a color. Doing so results in stronger synaptic weights along the word-reading pathways than the color-naming pathways. This means that the same level of input strength for both colors and words will produce a stronger, faster response along the word-reading pathway than the color-naming pathway. All else being equal, then, CDM will always read the word rather than name the color, and will do so without interference. It won't matter if the color word and ink color are the same, the word green written in green, or different, the word green written in red. The response will be based on the word, and there will be no interference. What happens if you want the model to name the ink color? As it stands now, the model can name colors only if there is no word stimulus. If a word is present, the model will always name the word, because those are the stronger, prepotent response pathways. So, to perform the Stroop task, the model needs cognitive control. And this is where that fourth layer that we haven't discussed yet comes in. The fourth layer is termed the task demand layer. This layer has task units, which are neurons corresponding to whichever task is currently instructed, either word reading or color naming. When the model is doing one of these two tasks, then the neuron representing that task is active in the task demand layer. This task demand layer delivers input to the hidden layer. As a consequence, whatever task demand is active in the task demand layer has the opportunity to directly influence the pathways linking the stimulus and response. With experience, the model can learn that input from the color naming neuron in the task demand layer to the hidden layer neurons along the color naming pathways is crucial for success. This is because activation of this task in CDM's task demand layer provides the additional input needed for the color naming pathway to win its competition with the stronger word reading pathway. Note that the converse will not be true. CDM will not learn that task demand input for word reading is necessary because the model will perform word reading successfully regardless of the state of the task demand unit for word reading. Further, though the model will ultimately produce the correct response when color naming, the competition from word reading will take a while to overcome. This means the model will take longer to respond on these color-word interference trials. Humans performing Stroop behave similarly, mostly saying the correct name of the ink color, but just taking longer to do so. Thus, we now have a basic mechanism for cognitive control that can change its behavior according to the task demands and behaves similarly to humans performing a Stroop task. And importantly, there was no need for a homunculus. The model learns both the response pathways and the incorporation of task demand units needed for success. Models like CDM intentionally simplify what would happen in a real brain. For example, no one is proposing that the brain relies on single neurons to stand for things like the color red. Furthermore, our brain has more than just a backpropagation algorithm for learning. But these differences between the model and the brain are not important for the goal of this theoretical investigation. If you like, you can think of those single neurons as representing whole populations of cells in a more complex system. This doesn't matter. The advantage of models is that they provide key insights into the kinds of minimal mechanisms we need for control. And there are several such insights to be gleaned, even in this simple case. First, the difference in strength across various action pathways highlights, in a rudimentary way, the continuum of automaticity in our own action repertoire. Often, we think of controlled and automatic behaviors as a strict dichotomy, as though we have two brains for doing two different things. One brain does things slowly, but in the service of goals, and the other does things quickly and without thought. We use one brain when we make our morning coffee, and the other when we make a Vietnamese egg coffee for the first time. However, this dichotomy is likely wrong. The reality is more continuous, much like the variable strengths across pathways in CDM. Some actions we perform are highly automatic, nearly habitual, and these have strong pathways from stimulus to response. Others are less automatic, and so are a bit weaker. And some tasks require entirely new combinations of actions and are very weak. When multiple pathways are elicited at once but are in conflict because we can't perform them all at once, the weaker pathways will lose unless they receive support from the control system. Word reading will always dominate color naming unless the control system steps in. If there is additional information about the situation that favors the weaker action pathway, such as the current goal or a task demand, then this input can provide a supporting signal that will boost the weaker pathway and allow it to win its competition. In so doing, we have contextualized the link between our situation and our behavior, and so have achieved the most basic kind of control. A second notable feature of the CDM model is that the pathways from stimulus to response do not run through the task demand layer. Rather, this layer acts like a train operator, sending its supporting influence to select the track along which the input from stimulus to response proceeds. This is only important when there is overlap and conflict. When the pathways do not compete, or when the appropriate pathway is strong enough on its own, the model does not need this top-down support. The situation is analogous to the kinds of intact automatic behaviors observed in patients with dysexecutive problems, like those seen in Chapter 1. The patient who got into Dr. Lairmeat's bed obviously did not have a problem carrying out this action. And when the patient performed it in his own home each evening, it was the appropriate thing to do. However, when this strong pathway conflicted with the weaker actions required by the novel context of his neurologist's bedroom, the weaker, correct pathway lost the competition to the stronger, incorrect one. Whether this was because he was unable to keep this context in mind, or was unable to deploy this context in a way that was usable as a control signal, the patient could not use the context to bolster the correct pathway in its competition. A third insight from the CDM model is that our task context must be actively maintained somewhere in our head to support weaker pathways. In the model, input from the task demand units is needed to bolster the weaker color naming pathway until it wins its competition. This input is needed even if the relevant contextual information is no longer present in the world, and so can't be acquired through the senses. If you are told at the beginning of the experiment to do the color naming task, you don't have to be told again for you to use it as a contextual signal. This is because you can maintain this task demand in your memory. It follows that sustained maintenance of contextual information is a key feature of cognitive control. Working memory is the cognitive system we use for this kind of active maintenance of useful information. As introduced in the last chapter, working memory holds a limited amount of information active and accessible for short periods of time. It is distinct from long-term memory, like episodic memory, that stores information over very long periods, but in a quiescent state. Rather, information in working memory is active in mind, but it is also rapidly lost. Once information is active in working memory, we can manipulate and operate on it, and can even use it to produce new ideas and thoughts. For example, add 31 and 24 in your head. Did you come to an answer? Now, reflect back on the process you went through. You needed to first hold the numbers 31 and 24 in mind, in your working memory. Then, you worked through whatever steps of addition you know in your head, updating and replacing the numbers as you went. Eventually, you came to your answer, not because it appeared anywhere in this audiobook, but rather it arose in your working memory from the operations performed within working memory itself. Working memory also provides a partial answer to our temporal abstraction problem introduced in Chapter 1. Recall that temporal abstraction occurs when we respond on the basis of goals or plans that are not immediately cued in our environment, or that need to hold sway over extended periods of time. Working memory is a means of bridging gaps in time. We can collect information through the senses, operate on that information to conceive of new thoughts, ideas, and goals. And then we can use this information to respond when the time is right. So, the CDM model places working memory front and center in cognitive control function because it is a means of actively maintaining task demands. How is a working memory for task demands supported in the brain? In another highly influential paper, John Cohen and neuroscientist Earl Miller proposed that the prefrontal cortex is uniquely suited for this working memory function. It is well known that damage to the prefrontal cortex produces problems with cognitive control. So it makes sense that they focused on this part of the brain. But the profound implication of their new hypothesis was that these patients' deficits stem from a loss of working memory for task contexts. In support of their hypothesis, Miller and Cohen cited a range of evidence relating properties of the prefrontal cortex to properties of the CDM model. They noted that electrophysiological recordings in the macaque monkey find neurons in the prefrontal cortex that fire selectively to specific bindings of stimuli and responses, and not just the stimuli or just the responses. In other words, prefrontal cortex neurons are responding to the rules of the tasks the monkey is performing. Further, prefrontal neurons maintain this rule information actively whenever those rules are relevant, a key requirement for working memory. Thus, rule coding by prefrontal neurons shares an attractive similarity to the task demand units found in the CDM model. The hypothesis that the prefrontal cortex supports working memory in the service of cognitive control has been widely influential. And in the years since Miller and Cohen's paper, there have been several refinements of this basic proposal. For instance, we now know that the prefrontal cortex is not the only region in the brain to exhibit evidence of working memory. Indeed, short-term maintenance of all kinds of useful information is evident throughout the cortex, including areas conventionally associated with primary sensation and perception. Heightened activity, or a higher likelihood of firing in these cells, can persist after an eliciting stimulus has arrived through the senses and subsequently departed from the environment. As such, this activity can support a short-term memory trace for the sensory information coded by these neurons that can be used by other systems for ongoing processing. However, what might be unique about the prefrontal cortex is not working memory in general, but working memory for task contexts, the active maintenance of rules, goals, task features, and any other information that can influence which actions we take and when. These task demand features are crucial for cognitive control. Further, we now know that the prefrontal cortex does not work alone to maintain the task demand features needed for cognitive control. Rather, the prefrontal cortex is part of a broader network of brain regions that serve this role. Indeed, more than one subnetwork involving different areas of the prefrontal cortex may be crucial for control. Nonetheless, fMRI studies have identified a consistent network of brain regions that are active when people engage cognitive control. One of the clearest delineations of this network came from an experiment published in 2013 by Evelina Fedorenko, John Duncan, and Nancy Kanwisher. In this study, people performed a variety of small tasks while being scanned with fMRI. The tasks differed in their specifics. Some involved remembering words. Others involved remembering spatial locations. Some required solving math problems. There was even a Stroop task. Importantly, however, each task included an easy condition and a hard condition. The definition of easy and hard was simply based on performance. The harder conditions would take longer and provoke more errors than the easy conditions. Despite the wide variety of tasks people performed, the hard conditions of each task yielded increased activation in a broad network of brain areas relative to the easy conditions. This network included a large area of the lateral frontal cortex, but it also included other regions in the frontal and parietal lobes. Because this network was more active for demanding tasks, regardless of the specific demands of the task, Fedorenko, Duncan, and Kanwisher referred to it as the multiple demand system. However, in this audiobook, we will broadly refer to this network as the frontoparietal control system. It makes sense that a network involved in cognitive control would tend to be more active for the difficult conditions of any task. Most theories of cognitive control agree that difficult tasks require breaking a problem down into manageable steps and managing these or choosing less well-learned response pathways. From the CDM perspective, difficult tasks will elicit weaker responses along the relevant response pathways, and so greater contextual support from task demand units is needed for these pathways to settle on a response. Strong evidence now links this frontoparietal network to cognitive control function. Damage to components of this network impairs performance on complex reasoning and problem-solving tasks that require cognitive control. And this deficit can occur even when other higher functions, like language, are preserved. This network is more active when people must adapt to and follow new rules on the fly. Furthermore, regions throughout this network maintain information about task rules. Thus, the frontal parietal system broadly supports cognitive control function, but this does not mean it is an indivisible network that acts like the CPU of the brain. Likewise, it does not mean that this is the only brain region that supports control. We will see in later chapters that other networks, also involving prefrontal cortex, are important for cognitive control function and serve related but distinct functions. Furthermore, the frontoparietal control system itself can be divided into separable networks. For example, network analysis of the human brain indicates that at least one cleavage of the frontoparietal control system is between a primarily lateral frontal and parietal network and a cingulo-opercular network. Further, there are additional subnetworks within the lateral frontoparietal network itself that interact when tasks require higher-order contexts. We will discuss this in Chapter 4. Thus, the frontoparietal control system is a broad-based delineation of areas consistently involved in cognitive control. But important distinctions needed to understand cognitive control function in the brain remain. In summary, working memory for task contexts, supported by a frontal parietal control network in the brain, is central to cognitive control. However, our discussion of working memory in cognitive control has so far left out one crucial feature. If working memory for task-relevant information is key to enacting the right response pathways for behavior, then this also means that getting the right task information into working memory is crucially important. In CDM, the task demands just arrive in working memory like any other input. Indeed, CDM's working memory has only 2 units, corresponding to the 2 tasks, and the correct one is active at the start of each trial, depending on which task the model needs to perform. This is fine for CDM, because the little world this model lives in consists of only reading words and naming colors. There is no need to be judicious about what to put into working memory or when to do so. Our brain has a harder problem to solve, however. Recall the scaling problem from Chapter 1. We live in a complex, multidimensional world with many potential tasks and contexts. Not everything we see or hear is a relevant task demand to be remembered. And likewise, not every task demand we have in mind should act as an influence on what we do every moment. To make matters worse, our working memory has a puny capacity. By current estimates, we can keep only around 3 to 4 memories active in working memory at a time. After that, we start forgetting or confusing what we are holding in mind. So, if we want to use our pea-sized working memory to control our behavior, we need to be judicious about what we let into memory and when we let it affect our behavior. In other words, we need to understand how working memory itself is controlled. Our brain's mechanisms for controlling the contents of working memory are the operators by which the control system implements the various goals, plans, and rules that we cook up for ourselves. They are the key bridge between thought and action. Given their centrality to cognitive control, in the remainder of this chapter, we will consider these mechanisms for controlling memory more fully and how they are realized in the brain. Stability versus flexibility. Like most academic scientists, I spend much of my day at my desk working on my computer, usually writing. Perhaps I'm working on a paper or a grant, or trying to finish a book chapter to meet a publisher's deadline. I use an Apple machine, and so also have Mac Mail as my email client. The Mac Mail icon hangs out in a dock at the bottom of my screen. As I work, the number in a little red badge on the mail icon will increment ever higher, telling me how many unread messages I have pending. This red badge can be a source of considerable distraction. It beckons continuously and becomes harder and harder to resist. However, if I want to finish my work on time, I must resist this other task and maintain focus on what I am doing. Maintaining task stability in the face of distraction is hard and doubtlessly requires cognitive control. Indeed, where possible, we often try to structure our environment to reduce distractions. People disable their phone or the internet. We can hide the dock on a Mac. Software is even marketed that will mandatorily restrict our computer to only one application, or will lock out our email for a preset period of time. So, task stability is not the default, but requires that measures be taken, whether external in our environment or internal through cognitive control. Of course, I do not want to be too stable either. Again, imagine I am working on my writing when a graduate student runs into my office with an emergency. Maybe our server just caught fire. I do not want to be so stable that I continue to doggedly write my manuscript while our whole data infrastructure burns down. I need to be able to stop what I am doing and shift to a new, higher priority task. Flexibly shifting to new tasks as the situation demands also requires cognitive control, particularly when the task we are shifting from is engaging, or the one we are shifting to is not. Ask any parent who wants their toddler to stop playing in order to have dinner or take a bath. Suddenly, a 3-year-old's task stability can rival anyone's. Thus, there is a fundamental trade-off between stability and flexibility, and our cognitive control system faces the dilemma of deciding when to be stable and when to be flexible. Indeed, this is a basic computational trade-off that transcends any one realization Be it the mind, or a computer, or a society, mechanisms that make that system more stable must also make it less flexible, and vice versa. How does the brain confront this dilemma when controlling what we are doing? If the brain is to maintain stable states, such as sustaining a task demand like color naming in working memory, mechanisms for doing so are going to balance against the demand to flexibly update those working memory states. Too much stability in memory would mean that we might miss updating relevant demands to memory, and obsolete demands would hang around in memory too long, taking up space. I'd still be thinking about making my morning coffee long after it was drunk and gone. Conversely, a highly flexible working memory would constantly overwrite its own contents with whatever input signal impinged on the system at any given moment. Given the ever-changing world we occupy, it would be hard to maintain focus on anything for any reasonable period of time. We would quickly fill up our little working memories with the happenstances of the moment. The brain's solution to the stability-flexibility problem in working memory is to impose a division of labor between the mechanisms for stable maintenance of information and those for controlling access to the maintained information. These mechanisms that control working memory are called working memory gates. A gate is a helpful metaphor for thinking about computation in a neural network like a brain. Gates exist in either of two states, open or closed. When they are closed, they prevent passage of information from one neural pathway to another. But given certain conditions, they are opened, and transmission proceeds. To see how the brain manages stability versus flexibility, we can extend this gating metaphor to control over working memory. First, a gate is needed to control what information from the world is allowed into networks supporting working memory. When the gate is open, new information enters the prefrontal cortex from perceptual systems to be maintained in working memory. We have flexibility. When the gate is closed, irrelevant information is kept out of prefrontal circuits, and what is there is protected. We have stability. This type of a gate is called an input gate because it controls what gets into memory and what stays out. Input gating is obviously adaptive in a world as rich and complex as ours. Innumerable inputs impinge on our senses, and many of these might signal distracting tasks. So, to avoid engaging that red badge on my mail icon, an input gate can stay closed to keep that distraction at bay and the task it cues out of my memory. Conversely, an input gate can also open to update memory when new important task information arises, such as my student asking for help. Sometimes contextual information is encountered that one wishes to hang on to for the immediate future, but not act on just yet. For example, imagine you are in a heated conversation with a friend about politics. At one point, they mention something you believe to be untrue. The impulse to interrupt them right then and there may be strong, but doing so would be rude and likely counterproductive to your discussion. Thus, the prudent course is to hold the gist of your comment in working memory and wait for the appropriate moment to let it fly. This example illustrates that not only is there an advantage to deciding what gets into working memory using an input gate, but there is also an advantage to deciding when the information hanging out in memory gets to exert control over behavior. We will call this second kind of gate an output gate, as it controls the output of working memory. When the output gate is closed, information in working memory is maintained and protected, but it does not influence behavior. When it is opened, the selected information in memory provides contextual support to our action pathways. In essence, we have placed a gate between the task demand layer and the hidden layer in the CDM model. When that gate opens, the neurons in the task demand layer can deliver their input to the response pathways and so influence what the model does. Getting the input and output gating right, in terms of what is gated in or out of working memory and when, may be at the very heart of efficient task performance. The world is a dynamic place with information changing around us in both space and time. We also have a vast repertoire of automated action pathways available at different levels of granularity, from simple movements to full-blown sequences and tasks. Thus, the right gating policy will specify the flow among these inputs and precompiled outputs effectively, analogous to control flow in a computer program. The right gating policy permits the right task demands to exert their influence at the right times. The wrong gating policy will subject us to errors and slips, lost contextual cues, inefficiency, or inappropriate behaviors. Identifying the right gating policy makes more concrete the elusive bridge between knowledge and action. Consider that instructions on how to perform even a simple task typically leave out the specifics needed to implement that task in your brain. Welcome to Madrid Airport. Signs will guide you to our connecting flight. This is a helpful instruction, but to actually follow this rule and make it to your connecting flight requires setting up a complex policy of working memory gating. You must decide when to monitor for signs, where to look for them, and what to look for on them. You must maintain information provided by the signs to direct your turns until new information arrives, while avoiding irrelevant information, and so forth. Travel is often particularly demanding on our cognitive control systems for precisely this reason. It places us in new environments where general rules must be given novel gating policies on the fly. Even a simple rule linking a stimulus to a response, like press A when you see a 1, must be translated into a gating policy to be implemented. Your brain must figure out that when A is seen somewhere, an input gate should open and hold that A as a context in working memory. Then, when it is time to respond, an output gate must be opened to allow the A to influence the choice of the response 1. None of these ins and outs are expressed in the rule we were told, and getting them just right without knowing precisely how A's appear and 1s are pressed is challenging. This is partly why even the simplest tasks still take a few attempts to reach their most efficient and consistent level of performance. As a scientist interested in these problems, it is hard for me to test people's working memory gating in the Madrid airport or a similar real-world setting. However, in the lab, I can test basic working memory gating with simplified experiments. Cognitive neuroscientist Christopher Chatham worked with me to develop one such procedure, which we term the context first/context last task. In this experiment, a number, a letter, and a symbol are presented one at a time on a computer screen to volunteers. The volunteers are told that immediately after each series, their memory will be tested for the identity of the letter, of the symbol, or of both. The number is a cue that will tell them whether letters or symbols or both are the targets that will be tested on that series. So, for example, say the number 1 means remember the letters, 2 means remember the symbols, and 3 means remember both. If the sequence 1 star A is seen, then A would be the target to remember for the memory test. In the preceding example, the number 1 provides a simple context that people can use to guide working memory gating. When they see the 1 first, they know that the upcoming letter must be remembered. They can translate that into a gating policy, wherein the input gate is closed to any symbols that appear, and the gate is opened for letters, like the A. In this way, only the A is kept in memory until the test. On other trials, however, Chris presented the number context last, as in star A 1. In this case, people would not know whether the star or the A would be tested, so they would have to hold both the letter and number in working memory initially. Then, on the final presentation of the 1, they could select the A from within working memory to guide their response. This selection from within memory would use an output gate, choosing the A in memory to be the control signal and not the star. When people perform this task in the lab, they find the series with the number context coming first to be easier than when it comes last, because they can use input gating to limit working memory to only the relevant item. We will call this way of doing the task the input gating policy. When our volunteers use the input gating policy, they block the symbol and remember the letter. And so the load on memory is only one item. They don't waste capacity on the irrelevant other item. By contrast, when the context comes last, they must hold both the letter and the number in mind until the context appears. As a result, people perform better when they use the input gating policy. Importantly, however, they don't have to use this input gating policy when the context comes first. Someone might just hold all the items they see in working memory anyway. Then they wait for the test to choose the relevant one from within memory and make a response, in effect, using an output gating policy. Given the higher load on memory, this output gating policy would result in a cost in time and accuracy on the test, and so it is inefficient. But it is a feasible way to do this task and would still follow the basic rules. Thus, we see here in a simplified laboratory example the basic distinction between knowing a rule and implementing it. Our volunteers' knowledge of the rule itself, in terms of how they should respond, given the numbers and letters they see, stays the same, regardless of the gating policy they choose. But they can use at least 2 gating policies to implement this same rule when the number context comes first. This is an intentionally simple experimental example that shows us how different gating policies can be used to solve the same task. In the complexity of the real world, gating policies are much more complex and harder for us to identify. But the point is the same. We must translate our rules and goals, from making coffee to navigating an airport, into gating policies. And the gating policy we choose will greatly affect the efficiency with which we perform these tasks. That said, in Chris's experiment, most people do spontaneously use the more efficient input gating policy. Even though no one tells them to do so, they try to match the best gating policy to the problem. And being humans with efficient cognitive control systems, they settle on good policies in general. But they don't have to do so. And under the right conditions, they will adopt the less efficient policy, at least initially. This was demonstrated in an experiment conducted by another scientist, Apurva Bandari, working with me. Unlike with the context first condition, when the context comes last, people must use the output gating strategy. Since they don't know whether the symbol or letter is relevant, they will have to remember both, and then choose one from memory at the end when they see the context. Apurva asked, what would happen if people had only ever experienced the context last orderings, and then were given a series where the context appeared first? Would they immediately switch and start using the input gating policy? Or, alternatively, Would they stick with the output gating policy that they had learned to use throughout their experience with this task? To answer these questions, Apoorva gave people the same rule and task that Chris Chatham had administered, with one key difference. When volunteers first performed the task, they got only the ordering with context appearing last, and so used only the output gating policy. Then, after they had practiced this order many times, Apoorva switched to giving them series in which the context appeared first. This was the first time the subjects had encountered this ordering, and, as expected, they were slower to choose the correct target after the change. In fact, they were even slower than people doing the task with this ordering for the very first time. As it's important, I'll unpack the significance of this last observation a bit more. Slower when they first do a task. This at least partly reflects the time they spend identifying the right gating policies. The present task is no exception. When people with no experience with the task first try a series with the context appearing first, they are slower to respond compared with when they have some practice. What is striking here, however, is that Apoorva's volunteers did have experience with the task, but only under the context last conditions that require an output gating policy. As a result, when they were put in a situation in which they should use an input gating policy, they were even slower to respond than people who were doing the experiment for the very first time. Apoorva showed in subsequent control experiments that this slowing was because they were using the output gating policy rather than the input gating policy. They could do the task, but inefficiently, because they had chosen the wrong gating policy. They had poorly mapped the rule to their action. This experiment provides evidence of negative transfer of a gating policy. Recall that transfer is bringing a solution from one problem to another analogous problem. With negative transfer, doing so makes one systematically worse at the new problem. People's experience with the task under discussion led them to adopt an outgoing gating policy that works when the context appears last, but is inefficient when the context appears first. What does this mean in the real world when we aren't remembering just letters and wingding characters? I'd argue that the implications are profound. When we implement a plan in a new environment, we need to get our working memory gating policy right. With a little experience, we typically come around to good gating policies, and we do so pretty quickly. Transfer from previous analogous experiences is an important piece of this process, and the gating policy we use will determine how effective we are at the new task. In other words, we build this information about the gating policy right into our concept of how to do the task, and we can readily access it when doing the task again. It is part of our compositional representation of the task, and so we can take gating policies we associate with one task and use them in new tasks as the situation demands. It follows that we must identify and execute the right working memory gating policies given our goals. Choose a good policy, and you will perform the task well. Choose a bad policy, and your performance may be inefficient, error-prone, or fail entirely. These policies can be complex, but at their base, they simply are specifying what information to let into working memory and what information in memory to let out and use as a contextual control signal. Reframed in this way, our question is no longer how does the brain enact cognitive control, but rather, how does the brain learn and implement a working memory gating policy? It turns out that the system the brain uses for working memory gating is not unique to working memory. Rather, the working memory gate may have evolved from a more basic and ancient circuit that controls simple movement functions. the motor gating circuit. When you make a voluntary movement, whether with an arm, a leg, or a finger, the command to your muscles to do so is issued by your primary motor cortex. Neurons in primary motor cortex project to the spinal cord along a major axonal highway called the corticospinal tract. In the spinal cord, major cortex neurons connect directly or indirectly through interneurons to spinal motor neurons that innervate the skeletal muscles. In this way, particular muscles or muscle groups are controlled by primary motor cortex neurons along that strip of motor cortex. Just in front of the primary motor cortex is a set of neocortical zones referred to as the premotor cortex and supplementary motor area. These two areas are among the major sources of input to the primary motor cortex. In contrast with motor cortex, which commands immediate voluntary movements, the supplementary motor and premotor cortex are important for movement planning. Much like neurons of primary motor cortex, premotor neurons also come to fire for particular movements, but firing in these cells can be elicited even when a person is only considering the movement rather than executing it. Further, cells in premotor cortex can fire for mappings between a sensory input and a specific reason. In essence, a simple rule. For example, in the laboratory, a monkey might learn that when a particular image appears, say a picture of a balloon, it should move a joystick to the left to receive a rewarding squirt of juice. This rule is an arbitrary mapping between a stimulus and response, because there is nothing particular about balloons related to leftward joystick movements or juice squirts outside the context of this experiment. Despite the rule's arbitrariness, however, the animal can learn it and will readily move the joystick to the left upon presentation of the balloon. Notably, once the rule is learned, specific cells within the premotor cortex will come to fire in response to the presentation of balloon on those trials when the animal plans its leftward movement. Indeed, like cells of the prefrontal cortex, premotor cells can come to fire for the rule itself. In this case, the image of the balloon and the movement, rather than for either just the stimulus or just the response without the two being linked. These simple stimulus-response rules are sometimes termed first-order policies, in that they directly instruct how to behave based on a stimulus, in this case, a balloon. This ability of premotor cortex to represent simple rules linking stimuli with movements distinguishes it from primary motor cortex, and is likely a consequence of the information it receives. Unlike motor cortex, which gets much of its input from the premotor cortex, the premotor cortex gets its input from other neocortical areas of the brain, such as parietal and occipital cortex, which process information from the senses into perceptions of objects, images, locations, and so forth. Thus, premotor cortex is well positioned to take in basic information about the world and generate possible movement plans based on those inputs, in accord with its rudimentary rules. Those rules can then influence motor cortex, where the movements they specify are elicited. Importantly, however, the activity among premotor neurons is typically not of sufficient strength to cause motor cortex to elicit an actual movement. Providing that drive requires interaction with a structure called the thalamus, and the involvement of yet another set of structures, termed the basal ganglia. The names and relationships among the nuclei of the basal ganglia are notoriously convoluted and arcane, and they surely compete for a top place among the most dreaded sources of undergraduate neuroscience exam questions. Yet from these knotty relationships comes the brain's version of a gate. This next bit is going to get into a little more hard-boiled neuroscience, But nature has come up with an elegant solution for gating of a movement. Let's peek under the hood to see how this gate works. Premotor and primary motor neurons share mutual connections with the thalamus. Rhythmic changes in neural activity between the thalamus and cortex provide the drive required to generate a specific movement. However, under most circumstances, this thalamic drive is absent because the thalamus is being constantly suppressed or inhibited by a nucleus of the basal ganglia called the internal segment of the globus pallidus. Metaphorically, a gate is closed, preventing the corticothalamic drive needed to move. Thus, to actually produce the movement being considered by premotor cortex, it is necessary to inhibit the globus pallidus, and so remove its suppressive influence on the thalamus. Inhibition of inhibition results in excitation, like multiplying two negative numbers. Scientists call this neural double negative disinhibition. Two populations of neurons in the striatum send input to the globus pallidus and thereby control the gate. Given their function, these two populations of neurons are sometimes referred to as go and no-go cells. Let's start with go cells. When go cells fire, they inhibit the globus pallidus. This suppresses the globus pallidus, which in turn disinhibits the thalamus. The resulting increase in thalamocortical drive results in the elicitation of whatever movement is being considered by premotor and motor cortex. Hence, when the go cells fire, the metaphorical gate goes from closed to open, and the movement proceeds. While the firing of go cells makes a movement more likely to be executed, firing of no-go cells has the opposite effect. No-go cells project to a different area of the globus pallidus called the external segment. The external segment of the globus pallidus exerts yet another inhibitory influence, this time on the internal segment. No-go cells inhibit this external segment, disinhibiting the internal segment, which allows the internal segment to exert an even greater inhibitory influence on thalamic drive. In other words, the no-go cells pull the gate closed more tightly and make the movement less likely to occur. It can be hard to follow all those inhibitions without a pen and paper. But the main thing to remember is that a movement being considered by the premotor cortex is less likely to be produced when the no-go pathway gets involved, and more likely to be produced when the go pathway is involved. Thus, the go and no-go pathways compete to open or close the gate to a movement, respectively. What influences the go and no-go cells? First, there are broad inputs to the striatum from all over the neocortex, including areas of the brain that process perceptual information from the senses. Thus, the striatum, much like the premotor cortex, has access to the sights and sounds that provide a context for action. If the premotor cortex is hearing about any juice-predicting balloons, then so is the striatum. Second, striatum receives projections directly from the premotor and motor cortex areas it controls with its gait. So the striatum also hears about the actions currently under consideration by premotor cortex. This arrangement forms a feedback control loop between cortex and striatum. In essence, the go and no-go cells decide whether an action considered by the premotor cortex should be taken or not, given all current inputs. Go cells are considering evidence among the inputs in favor of taking the action in premotor cortex. No-go cells are considering the evidence against taking the action. Thus, the combined firing of go and no-go cells is like votes for or against the action considered in premotor cortex. When go cells win the election, the gate is opened and the action is executed. No-go cells vote against the action and so increase the number of go votes required to open the gate. In this way, the brain has a biological servo mechanism for controlling when and under what conditions action execution can occur. At this point, you might be wondering how the go and no-go corticostriatal pathways know which actions are good ones to take and which ones are not. This is important because, without an explanation, we have effectively posited another homunculus and named it striatum. Learning is again the answer to our homunculus problem, though rather than backpropagation, this time reward-based reinforcement learning can replace our homunculus. As we will discuss in more detail in Chapter 7, the striatum also receives a major input from systems carrying dopamine, a neurotransmitter modulated by rewarding experiences. To keep the discussion simple at present, when we take actions that lead to positive or negative outcomes, dopamine levels are modulated upward or downward accordingly. Among other effects, changes in dopamine levels affect the strength of the synapses in the striatum, making go or no-go cells stronger. In this way, the striatum can learn over time what combinations of context and action are likely to yield rewarding outcomes in the future, and which are not. Thus, the go and no-go pathways use a history of reward to act as positive and negative feedback loops, respectively, for the actions being considered by premotor cortex. An important consequence of this basal ganglia motor gate is that the brain can consider actions without actually performing them. This is an adaptive ability indeed. Consider how difficult it would be to survive if you just did every action you thought of. Our short, chaotic lives would be a continuous chain of spilled drinks, stubbed toes, and awkward moments. Gating allows an action to be planned in detail and then to sit in wait, potentiated and ready for the right conditions to act. In this way, execution of actions can be timed to those conditions and circumstances that will place the animal at its greatest advantage when it is most likely to attain a positive outcome. Indeed, motor gating is so adaptive, it is an ancient and highly conserved biological innovation. The main structures of the basal ganglia and their role in gating the output from the motor system were present in an ancestor that we share in common with the lamprey. The lamprey is an eel-like creature whose lineage split from that of other vertebrates some 40 million years ago. When nature finds a good solution, it sticks with it. And this is a solution shared not just among all primates or even all mammals, but among all vertebrates. However, as mammals evolved neocortex and primates developed expanded frontal and prefrontal cortex, multiple loops between the cortex and the basal ganglia developed. With these elaborations, the basal ganglia system evolved to serve a new purpose: controlling working memory gates. From movements to memories. Computational cognitive neuroscientists Michael Frank and Randy O'Reilly first proposed the hypothesis that the same corticobasal ganglia loops that control movements might also serve to gate working memory. Michael Frank is now a leading computational neuroscientist and colleague of mine at Brown. However, this idea initially came out of a final project for a class that Frank was taking with O'Reilly when Frank was a graduate student at the University of Colorado. Frank had been trying to figure out how to get working memory gating into Cohen's CDM model. Most of the tricks he tried involved what we might term global gating signals, like bursts of dopamine to the prefrontal cortex that would trigger an update to working memory. The problem, however, was that these global gating signals either updated everything in working memory or nothing at all. This was a clunky way to do business. If there was a task that required hanging on to some information in memory while updating other information, it was not possible using this global mechanism. Likewise, there was no way to control both input and output of working memory with separate gates. Frank and O'Reilly's solution was to apply the corticostriatal loop motor gate to working memory in prefrontal cortex. It was an elegant approach. First, it solved the stability-flexibility problem by separating the actions of updating working memory and maintaining working memory into different structures. If the prefrontal cortex supported stability in terms of the maintenance of rules and task contexts over time, the basal ganglia could support flexibility by enacting input and output gates. Second, corticostriatal gating got around the problem of global gates because the loops between cortex and striatum are topographically organized systems. This means that specific sets of cells in the cortex input to a specific set of cells in the striatum, which ultimately affect the corticothalamic drive of the specific cells back in the cortex. Just as these topographically organized loops can amplify specific movements, they can also select specific items from working memory to update or output. Thus, a corticostriatal mechanism permitted selective, rather than global, working memory gating. Finally, given the association of the striatum with dopamine, corticostriatal loops provided a very natural way for working memory gating policies to be learned and implemented without recourse to a homunculus. As introduced in the preceding section, the influence of dopamine in striatum could train the go and no-go cells in the striatum to determine which task demand information was valuable to update to working memory or to output from working memory, given the task context. To see how gating a memory might work in this system, let's step through the basic process. Imagine a context is being maintained by the prefrontal cortex, such as the color naming task demand during Stroop. The neurons that code the color naming task send projections to the go and no-go cells of the striatum. These two cell populations weigh this input along with other information about the broader context and vote for or against acting on it. If the go cells win the vote, then the thalamus is disinhibited, and there is a transfer of this context information to output layers of the cortex, where its output can serve to strengthen the color naming response in its competition with word reading. This is exactly analogous to the way that movements were output through the corticobasal ganglia loop. However, here a rule, plan, goal, or context is selected out of working memory to provide a top-down influence. In other words, we have a biological mechanism for output gating. This mechanism can implement an input gate as well. As inputs come into prefrontal cortex from sensory or memory or planning systems, they are evaluated for their value by the voting of go and no-go cells. In other words, are they worth maintaining in working memory given the current task or context? If they are valuable to maintain, the activity of go cells and resulting disinhibition of the thalamus triggers the necessary dynamics to maintain this information active in working memory. We have an input gate. Thus, rather than assuming that we sprouted an entirely new system for doing working memory gating, the brain extended a solution it already had from the ancient motor loop. This fits well with what we know from comparative anatomy of the frontal lobes themselves. As discussed in Chapter 2, the primate lineage saw a progressive expansion of the frontal cortex, particularly in the anterior portions of prefrontal cortex. These elaborations reproduce the corticostriatal thalamic loops present in older motor areas, but now applied the same gating computation to the more abstract kinds of information about tasks and goals and rules coded by prefrontal cells. Thus, the ability to gate memory in more elaborate ways enhanced the control capability of primate and, ultimately, human working memory. This elaboration supported a deepened capacity to link rules, goals, and plans to compositional actions. They enabled cognitive control. From this perspective, then, it wasn't just working memory capacity that deepened over the course of evolution, peaking in Homo sapiens. Rather, it was the progressive ability to engage more elaborated gating policies. Indeed, as we will discuss in Chapter 4, multiple working memory gating loops permit the system to solve deeper planning and task control hierarchies. This deep capacity for gating working memory, when combined with an advanced capacity for episodic future thought, could be the combination needed for human-level general intelligence. In sum, then, disinhibitory dynamics between the frontal cortex, basal ganglia, and thalamus provide a plausible mechanism for working memory gating. It should be pointed out that this model of working memory gating is far from settled science. Other plausible biological implementations of gates do not require these corticostriatal interactions. Nonetheless, the basic striatal gating hypothesis has received initial empirical support. Neuroimaging experiments have shown that prefrontal cortex and the striatum are active during input gating to working memory. Patients with lesions to the prefrontal cortex versus the striatum, respectively, show problems maintaining items in working memory versus input gating. Taking drugs that increase or decrease striatal dopamine accordingly affects input gating, and output gating increases communication between the striatum and the prefrontal cortex in the human brain, even when no movement is being planned or executed. These observations are all consistent with the hypothesis that working memory gating is supported by interactions between the prefrontal cortex and the striatum. Further, the corticostriatal gating hypothesis not only explains working memory gating, but also easily accommodates the learning problem. For this reason, this is the model we will rely on in the remaining chapters of this audiobook. Let us return to our problem of receiving a text while driving, now armed with some of the basic theoretical ideas we have discussed in this chapter. To avoid reading our text message and selecting a different course of action, it is important that the context of driving is being maintained in working memory. That is, the action of Go cells will need to engage an input gate, so this context is maintained in working memory, likely as soon as we are in the car. Furthermore, this context will need to be output gated from working memory at the right moment to influence decisions about whether to focus on the road or the phone. Even in this cartoon description, it is easy to see that there are multiple places where things could go awry. For example, we could fail to update the context of driving, or we might lose it from working memory. We could fail to output gate the context from memory, or could do so at the wrong time. Further, other control demands in this scenario we have not touched on yet are surely important. For example, there likely are inhibitory mechanisms needed to quickly stop any impulse to check the phone. No-go cells might partly contribute to this step, making it harder to select the phone action. But, as we will see, this is not the whole story with inhibition. Further, there are motivational dimensions to this problem that might also explain why people so readily fail in this case. In other words, people might look at the phone because they really want to see that text more than they want to avoid distracted driving. In the following chapters, we will anchor our discussion of cognitive control within the framework of working memory gating. We will consider the many facets of our controlled behavior from this perspective, and we will add new pieces to this system along the way, ranging from more complex hierarchical control to inhibition, to motivation, to the control of memory. However, at its core, our prevailing thesis will be that cognitive control requires translating contexts and predictions from our internal model of the world to a set of policies for gating working memory. Chapter 4: Hierarchies in the Head. Like many academics, I travel fairly regularly. As a result, I am keenly aware of the many ways that travel taxes a cognitive control system needed to get things done in unfamiliar circumstances. For example, on just about every trip I take, I must confront the problem of locating a decent cup of coffee first thing in the morning in a hotel without having to go to any great lengths. For caffeine addicts, you see, coffee itself is required to go to any great lengths, so this is quite a dilemma. And those freeze-dried packets of mummified coffee that many hotels offer in the room are decidedly not a solution. Finding coffee usually means leaving the room. I might find real coffee in the lobby, or I might find it 2 blocks away at a coffee shop. However, if I leave the room, I need to get dressed first. Should I fully shower and dress for the day? Or perhaps I should just throw on some jeans, a coat over my pajamas, and a hat over my bed head, and try to slip by without talking to anyone. One enterprising cognitive neuroscientist friend of mine from University of California, Davis, has taken to roasting and grinding his own beans, and then packaging them in filter packets compatible with the machines hotels offer in the room. The coffee problem inspires great and desperate measures indeed. When solving the coffee problem, or any such planning problem, we benefit from the abstract, hierarchical nature of action we introduced in Chapter 1. On the first morning of my stay in a hotel, I often do not know exactly how I will get coffee. Rather, my goal of having coffee will hang around without any specifics until I get down to the lobby and see whether they have a coffee shop or a complimentary beverage service, or neither. In this form, my goal is an abstraction over all the ways I could have coffee. But even in this abstract form, my goal of having coffee is useful for control. I can plan other activities around it, such as whether I will shower first or not. And I can do all this without knowing the specifics of how I will get the coffee. Of course, to actually get coffee, I will ultimately have to perform a series of more specific sub-goals that I come up with on the fly. For example, if I enter the lobby and see a coffee shop, then I will need to initiate a sequence of queuing, ordering, paying, waiting, getting, and shuffling back up to my room quickly so no one sees that I'm not wearing socks. I invent these sub-goals in that moment and perform them in a particular sequence, only some of which can be conducted out of order. For example, I doubt it will make much difference if I thank the barista before or after I pay. However, I am fairly certain it will make a mess of matters if I try to pay before ordering. Thus, the details of getting coffee include not only the subtasks, but also some structure in time by which those subtasks are pursued. The hierarchical nature of action allows that I can break down my sub-goals into increasingly finer sub-sub-goals, and sub-goals, until I ultimately arrive at a specific sequence of movements across my hands, fingers, arms, feet, legs, neck, mouth, tongue, and eyes that obtain a particular cup of coffee on a particular occasion. At each finer grain of description, the goals are more concrete and more specific, and usually prevail for a shorter period of time. Further, as they become more concrete, the sub-goals I set tend to be more constrained by the particular features of the environment. For example, where I walk while getting coffee is determined as much by the location of the barista, the cashier, and the cream and sugar as it is by my mental sub-goal. Control of any behavior must contend with this hierarchical property of action in some way. Our human control system is adept at organizing our actions, not just in the immediacy of the moment, but over time and at multiple levels of abstraction. It can hang on to abstract goals, like finding some coffee, while also addressing more immediate concerns, like finding the right method of payment at the register. In this chapter, we will address more directly how our brain does this and controls complex, sequential, and hierarchical behaviors. In particular, we will see how elaboration of the basic working memory gating system introduced in Chapter 3 can solve this problem. It is important to caution, however, that though tasks can be described hierarchically, in terms of goals and sub-goals, this alone does not require that the system carrying out a task be itself hierarchical or operate hierarchically. In other words, the brain need not represent actions hierarchically or implement control systems that contend directly with multiple levels of hierarchical structure. The spider from Chapter 2 does not maintain multiple abstract goals concerning its web-making plan, though the process of web construction is readily described hierarchically. Thus, simply because an action can be described at multiple levels of abstraction does not mean that the brain is maintaining all these goals and sub-goals in the head. Indeed, early psychological theories made some mileage on sequential behavior, while assuming that the system was expressly not hierarchical. It is helpful, then, to consider the evolution of these theories and the various responses to them, to appreciate where action hierarchies fit with cognitive control and how our brain contends with them. Hierarchical structure and behavior. Edward Titchener was among the founders of the structuralist school of psychology in the late 19th century. Structuralists tried to understand how simple elements of the mind, essentially mental images, were associated with each other or structured to yield psychological experience. Their primary methodology was called introspection. Structuralists sought to use the mind's eye as an apparatus for scientific observation to record the progress of their own internal thoughts. Titchener believed that sequential thoughts, behaviors, and meanings were formed through a successive series of images connected to each other through chains of associations. When one image came to mind, such as putting sugar in coffee, then the next image, putting cream, would become active because of its association with the first image. Chaining these associated images from one to the next could yield streams of thought that unfolded in time. Sequential behavior progressed by following whatever these images instructed. To illustrate, Titchener provided the example of giving a speech. In Titchener's view, when an orator spoke, a series of auditory images would come to her or his mind. Each auditory image would trigger the next image through an association, and this chain of auditory images would guide the speaker along. Titchener could hear my own voice speaking just ahead of me, and this instructed him what to say next. In the structuralist's associative image chain, then, there is no need for a plan or hierarchical representation of thought or action. The mere association of each step of a sequence with the next in memory is sufficient to guide you through the course of a lecture, a task, or perhaps the entire day, moving from each impending action to the next, as the chain of images unfolds before you like a path through the mind. The behaviorist school of psychology that followed in the early 20th century rejected structuralism and its introspective methods as unscientific piffle. However, when it came to sequential behavior, they didn't do away with chaining. They merely replaced chains of associated images with chains of their own, peripheral action chains. The scientist Margaret Floy Washburn likely did the most to develop the behaviorist theory of sequential action. Washburn started as a student of Titchener's at Cornell University, and in 1894 became the first woman to be awarded a Ph.D. in psychology. Her career spanned more than 30 years, during which time she transitioned from structuralism to behaviorism, and made a number of important contributions to the field. Among her various honors, Washburn was elected president of the American Psychological Association, and she became the first woman psychologist and second woman in any science to be elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 1931. Washburn sought to move from Titchener's image association chains to a framework that did not depend on conscious experience, which she viewed as an unimportant byproduct of sequential behavior rather than a cause of it. She replaced image associations with peripheral trigger chains. These chains explain sequential action as a series of reflexive triggers, with the execution of each action being elicited by the bodily sensations of the action that preceded it. Thus, the movements associated with the action of grinding coffee beans elicited sensations that would trigger the associated action of filling the coffee filter. The sensations of filling the filter triggered the action of adding water to the drip machine, and so forth. Other behaviorists, like John B. Watson, extended this idea of peripheral chaining to speech, and then thought itself, which he conceptualized as the chaining of subvocal speech. Whether they depended on central mental images or peripheral action sensations, chaining theories explain sequential behavior without the system having any hierarchical or superordinate goal, much less a control system that influenced the course of action. However, as we shall see, these ideas were a poor match to how people actually engage in sequential behavior. The 1948 Hickson Symposium at the California Institute of Technology turned out to be a landmark in the science of the mind and brain. The symposium brought together a distinguished group of psychologists, neuroscientists, and mathematicians to discuss the neural mechanisms of behavior from multiple perspectives. Its pioneering interdisciplinary approach likely foreshadowed the field of cognitive science, which would revolutionize psychology only a few years later. Among the attendees at the meeting was Harvard psychologist and neuroscientist Carl Lashley, who delivered a seminal lecture that focused specifically on how we plan, sequence, and carry out a sequence of actions. In his lecture, Lashley broke sharply from chaining theories and arguably set the stage for the next half-century of research in this area by arguing instead for a central, hierarchical control system. Lashley explicitly criticized chaining theories for excluding a central guiding goal or knowledge of the overall sequence. Poking fun at Titchener's introspections regarding associated auditory images, Lashley remarked, "What solution of the lecture problem for the lazy man? He need not think, but only listen to his own inner voice, to the chain of associated auditory images. Behaviorists and their peripheral chain theory of language had it even better. A behaviorist colleague had reached a stage where he could arise before an audience, turn his mouth loose, and go to sleep, Lashley joked. This clearly demonstrates the superiority of behavioristic over introspective psychology. The behaviorist does not even have to listen to his own inner voice. The problem with these sequential models, according to Lashley, was that they could not account for the simple fact that people will finish sequential tasks even when they fail at a sub-goal. Have you ever accidentally washed your hair twice while showering, or forgotten to grab your wallet when leaving the house? When you committed these errors, did you stop showering at that point, or freeze as you left the house, unable to go further? Probably not. Rather, you've likely had the opposite experience on occasion, not realizing your error until later, perhaps even long after the task was done. In the course of any task, people will occasionally leave out steps, double a step, reverse a step with another, perform a step at the wrong point in a sequence, or even include a step from another task. Certainly, I'll own that I have made any number of typos while writing this audiobook. Typos are a sequential error, and they exhibit the same kinds of reversals, omissions, and repetitions seen in more complex sequential actions, like showering or making coffee. Yet, when we make typos, we typically don't terminate the word when the error is committed. Rather, we often finish the word and then go back and correct it. Other times, we miss that we made the typo at all and continue to finish the sentence, paragraph, or entire paper. We may remain unaware of the error until its discovery by a sharp-eyed reader long after. This slip blindness occurs with more complex actions, too. It is well documented in error diary studies, in which volunteers agreed to record all the various daily follies in a journal for scientists to analyze. These accounts include striking examples of slips that aren't caught immediately. For example, while having breakfast, one diarist failed to realize they had poured orange juice into their coffee cup at breakfast. They proceeded to drink the whole cup, oblivious to their error, until they noticed the telltale rim of juice left at the bottom of the mug when they were done. Early chaining models of sequential behavior would not predict that finishing these sequences is possible. Rather, as each step depends on the correct execution of the one immediately preceding it, any distortion of the steps in the sequence would disrupt the sequence catastrophically. If I left out the step of pouring water into my drip machine, then there would be no peripheral sensations related to pouring, and thus no trigger for the next association in the sequence, no bridge to the next action. The chain would break, and the task would self-terminate. As I have no knowledge of my overall goal or plan for the sequence, I am stuck, unable to proceed, and without a basis for getting back on track. In place of chains, then, Lashley proposed that we must hold a memory for our overall task goal that abstracts over the individual sub-goal steps, in the way that the goal of making coffee abstracts over the sub-goals of pouring water or adding grounds. He proposed that these central abstract representations of the task persist, regardless of the status of each individual sub-goal step. This abstract representation can determine the next sub-goal in sequence. If a sub-goal is lost or reversed or repeated, this does not affect the overall sequence, because the abstract task goal is enough to retrieve the next sub-goal in sequence. Thus, Lashley proposed that we must have some hierarchical representation of action, with abstract goals being separated from more concrete ones. Lashley's ideas also explicitly introduced control into the problem of executing a sequential behavior. He pointed out that the human brain is not a static system that plods along from one sub-goal state to the next, without any idea of where it is going or where it has been. Rather, because the brain and its situation in the world are dynamic, any progress through a task constitutes a route through multiple changing brain states. The problem for completing a serial task, then, concerns how the system can accommodate small changes to its setting and progress, and yet maintain its course. For example, when I make coffee each morning, there are endless little differences I must accommodate. Sometimes items have moved around the kitchen. Other times I am interrupted by one of my children. I might be sleepy or sick or feeling happy or frustrated. It is unlikely that any two instances of performing that task are identical, and so the brain states I experience are not identical either. What connects these diverse experiences is an abstract description, a goal of making coffee. Staying on task while experiencing slight differences in the exact experience of each sub-goal, even without making errors, is the norm for sequential action. Lashley's insight was that we must have a way of linking subtasks we perform to an abstract overall task representation that persists in time despite these specific differences. For Lashley, this required a central representation of the task that was held separately, such as in a distinct neural representation, from the representation of the sub-goal actions. However, it turns out that Lashley may have been only partly right on this point. He was right that there should be a way to hang on to some abstract task representation. But this abstract task representation need not always be separate from the individual sub-goal steps. In his reasoning, Lashley failed to distinguish between the control of sequential action and the execution of an automated behavior. As we've already noted, complex sequential actions can be carried out automatically, given enough experience with them. And experience with a task will also affect the sequential errors one makes. For example, when I make coffee at home, I fill the carafe with water and then pour it into my drip machine. As I repeatedly fill my carafe to make coffee each morning, I strengthen this response pathway. I automate it. Thus, I form an association between the subtask of filling the carafe with the other sub-goals needed to make coffee. The compositional nature of action allows that if I wanted to heat water to make tea one day using my carafe, I could transfer my carafe filling subroutine to this new task. However, because of the association I formed between carafe filling and coffee making, there is a chance I might find myself trying to fill my coffee machine with ground coffee beans and absent-mindedly making coffee rather than heating water for tea. This type of slip of action is described as a capture error, because it is as though the course of action for tea making was captured by the task of coffee making. On first blush, capture errors sound like a return to a chaining model of sequential behavior. The chained association that carafe filling has with the subsequent subtask of filling my drip machine could presumably explain why I perform this incorrect action, despite my overall goal of making tea. How can this occur in the same system that will finish making coffee, even after I failed to pour water into the drip machine? 50 years after Lashley, computational cognitive neuroscientists Matt Botvinnik and David Plaut addressed the question of how associated representations might result in sequence errors, including capture errors, while not requiring a separate task representation. They constructed a neural network model that learned how to make coffee and make tea. In this model, coffee making and tea making simply referred to the sequence of activity patterns across the model's simulated action neurons that corresponded to the correct subtask at the right point in the sequence. The model learned to perform each subtask in sequence for each overall task of coffee or tea making. After the model learned, Botvinnik and Plaut added some noise to the model by having sets of neurons fire randomly. This noise made the model vulnerable to errors, including omissions or reversals or capture errors. Nevertheless, akin to human sequential behavior, these slips of action by the model did not result in termination of the sequence. Rather, the model would attempt to complete the task despite the slip. How did this model complete these sequential tasks when it did not have access to a separate abstract representation of the task goal? To answer this question, Botvinnik and Plaut analyzed the patterns of neural activity the model used to perform each subtask. They found two important features of these neural patterns that help us understand both the errors the model made and its ability to perform despite these errors. First, subtasks from the same overall task had similar patterns of neural activity. This similarity is sometimes referred to as a family resemblance. Relatives in the same family look similar, though they are also distinguishable as individuals. Accordingly, the subtasks from a particular task, though distinct from one another, nonetheless were shaded in their pattern of neural activity based on a family resemblance. Further, as subtasks from an overall task shared a family resemblance, it follows that the overall task could be gleaned from the pattern of activity of the subtask. The model wasn't just representing the subtask pouring water. It had a unique pattern for pouring water while making coffee. This way, the model kept the memory of the overall task active, even if some of the sub-goals were lost or degraded. Unlike in early chaining models, the model kept track of the overall task, but it didn't need a separate representation of that task to do so. Second, some sub-goals used for both making coffee and making tea also shared a family resemblance with each other. Concretely, pouring water for coffee shared a family resemblance with pouring water for tea. As a consequence, the model would naturally produce capture errors for much the same reason that it can persist at a task when it loses sub-goal steps. The similarity of the pattern for pouring water for tea to the same subtask of coffee making could result in the model's switching tasks from tea making to coffee making, a simulated capture error. This can be confusing, so let's consider another example. Imagine you are driving to a friend's house. However, the route you take to your friend's house is similar to the route you would usually take to your office. There is overlap in the sequence of turns, and somewhere along the way there is a critical intersection where you would usually turn left to go to your office, but today you need to turn right. This intersection is the critical choice point of the two tasks. If you turn the correct way at this juncture, there is no longer a danger of committing the capture error for the remainder of the route, because it no longer overlaps the route to your office. If you turn the wrong way, you might not notice until you pull up to your office parking lot. After that choice, the sub-goal steps themselves just reinforced persistence on the wrong task. An essential aspect of this example is that the competing task of going to your office is automatic, that you drive that same route to work each day. In other words, because it is automatic, the wrong task has an advantage in the competition, and so it is likely to capture your performance at that critical overlap point. If you have made a soufflé only once in your life, there is little worry that you will suddenly find yourself making one when you crack an egg. Botvinnik and Plaut's model demonstrates that the kinds of sequential errors with which Lashley was concerned could arise as a consequence of associations, without a separate higher-order representation. A key revision to early chaining models, however, is that the subgoals themselves also include abstract information about the overall task in their neural representation. Thus, performing the components of the task supports the overall memory of the task one is doing. In such situations, a separate representation of the overall task goal is not required to explain how people perform well-learned sequential tasks. This does not mean, however, that we never have an abstract goal for what we are doing that we hold independently in mind from the sub-goals of a task. As the opening example illustrated, I can have the goal of getting coffee long before I am performing the specific sub-goals to get the coffee. Indeed, I can have it before I even know what those steps will be. Control of sequential action may be the particular circumstance when these abstract representations are used. There is now neuroscience evidence that when we control our performance on sequential tasks, we do rely on distinct abstract representations, just as Lashley hypothesized. These abstract representations are what help us assemble new sequences on the fly out of our precompiled automatic routines. To monitor our performance, to avoid capture errors and other slips, and to get us back on track should we make an error. My colleague, Teresa DeRochers, in the Department of Neuroscience at Brown, is an expert in the neuroscience of sequential behavior. Teresa and I collaborated when she was a postdoc in my lab in order to understand the neural systems supporting sequential cognitive control. We asked our research volunteers to categorize either the color or the shape of a stimulus presented on a computer screen. There was nothing about the stimulus that told them which task to do. Rather, we instructed them to follow a specific sequence of categorizations as each item appeared. For example, they might be told that for the first item they see, they should categorize its color, then shape for the next item, then shape again for the item after that, and finally color for the item after that. As items continued to appear, they would repeat that four-task sequence: color, shape, shape, color, until items stopped appearing. This is a laboratory version of a sequential task, but instead of sub-goals like pour water and grind beans, here the sub-goals were to categorize the color or shape of items. And as there were no cues telling our volunteers which task to do, they had to do so based on their own internal register of where they were in the sequence. I should note that this situation is not unusual in real life. We often do not have cues in the environment to tell us what task to do next in a sequence. For example, when most people shower, they take a top-down approach, washing their hair, then face, then body, and so forth. However, if they zone out for a moment, thinking about something else, and forget what they have already done, there are few cues to tell them whether they have already washed their hair or face. Yet, people can and do keep track of what they are doing in these settings and perform these kinds of sequential tasks routinely. Our experiment was no exception. People were able to track which task to do in their head and cycled the four-task sequence correctly. Teresa scanned our volunteers using fMRI while they performed this sequential task, and she discovered that a region in the frontmost part of the prefrontal cortex, called the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex, progressively ramped up its activity with each step through the four-task sequence, having its minimum at the beginning of the sequence and reaching its maximum at the end. In other words, activity in the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex tracked the sequence position. Its activity did not change, however, based on what specific categorization task was being performed at that position, or what physical response the person was making. The activity in rostrolateral prefrontal cortex was tracking an abstract property of the task, namely the sequence position, which was separate from the sub-goals being performed. Further, this activity in rostrolateral prefrontal cortex was needed for task performance. In a second set of experiments, Teresa found that when she stimulated the participants' rostrolateral prefrontal cortex using a type of safe focal brain stimulation technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, she could disrupt their behavior and induce errors with increasing likelihood as the sequence progressed. Stimulating other parts of the brain did not have this effect. In other words, the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex is increasingly necessary as a sequence progresses, regardless of the specific sub-goals being performed in the sequence. We will discuss the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex further later in this chapter, but Teresa's experiment demonstrated that humans track abstract properties of sequential tasks, like sequence position, and use them to aid their performance of the task. Other recent work has used sophisticated neural decoding methods to show that the brain tracks sequence position, abstracted over the specifics of the subtask being performed. Thus, evidence from the brain indicates that humans can maintain separate, abstract contextual information about sequential tasks, as Lashley anticipated. When we automate tasks, it is likely that we form association chains, as in the Botvinnik and Plaut model. These chains allow for stable behavior without much input from cognitive control systems. Indeed, for heavily automated tasks, we often rely on this chaining property. If we are reciting the alphabet and get interrupted, it is often easier to start over than try to pick up from where we left off, for example. Importantly, however, capture errors and other slips of action also arise because of the associative nature of these chains. We can reduce these errors through cognitive control that relies on separate task content representations maintained in working memory. However, because the structure of sequential action is hierarchical, this monitoring and control should occur at multiple levels of abstraction as well. I should be able to monitor and provide control for my coffee task at the level of the sub-goals, like pouring water, or the higher-order goals, like making coffee, depending on where the overlap with conflicting tasks arises and where state support is needed. This ability to exert control at multiple levels of abstraction is the problem of hierarchical cognitive control. How does the brain solve this problem to control complex behavior? In the remaining sections of this chapter, we will delve a bit more into how we can structure tasks hierarchically and the strengths and weaknesses of doing so. Then, we will consider how the corticobasal ganglia gating mechanisms we introduced in Chapter 3 are well suited to managing these kinds of hierarchical structures. Tasks and trees. The principles of hierarchical cognitive control during sequential behavior also apply to following rules that link circumstances in our world to our behavior. For example, as we saw in Chapter 3, the interference during the Stroop task arises as a result of overlap between two pathways at the response layer. The propagation of neural firing from the sensory to the hidden to the response layer in CDM is like the sequential pathway through sub-goals while making coffee or turns while driving to a friend's house. Just as with sequential tasks, overlap between response pathways results in competition and the risk of capture by the stronger word-reading pathway when one should be naming colors. To resolve this competition, A separate abstract representation of a task demand tips the competition between the pathways in favor of the appropriate task. Thus, following a rule that maps stimuli we perceive to the responses we make shares much in common with a sequential task. Also, just as with sequential tasks, rules themselves can be expressed at multiple hierarchical levels. For example, when they were younger, both of my boys struggled mightily with the indoor voice rule. You might be familiar with this rule. It stipulates that when we are inside, we should speak in a soft voice, whereas outside, we are allowed to be loud, both in voice and behavior. For a number of years, reminders to use our indoor voice were a constant refrain around our house. No doubt this was partly because this is a challenging control problem for a child. The child must hold the context of being indoors in working memory, and then use this to influence how they speak, perhaps in opposition to the overwhelming impulse to shout at their sibling or shriek with joy. As they got older, however, our boys developed a more sophisticated, deeper hierarchical version of this rule. They worked out that the indoor voice rule is a member of a class of rules that applies only if my wife and I are around. In this new rule, I am a context, but a superordinate and abstract one. My presence doesn't directly influence how they speak. Rather, my presence tells them how to relate other aspects of their context, such as whether they are indoors or outside, to their behavior. Thus, monitoring superordinate contexts is often necessary to resolve competition about how other aspects of context itself might be used to control behavior. One can set up a similar hierarchical rule structure to the indoor voice example in the laboratory, but using simpler contexts and behaviors. Imagine that you come to my lab. I place you in front of a computer screen, and I give you a button to hold in each hand. Then I tell you whenever you see a blue object on the screen, press the button in your left hand. When you see a red shape, press the button in your right hand. These simple rules can be depicted as a decision tree. There's a single branch point on the tree, which specifies how you choose a response based on color. You get the hang of this simple task pretty rapidly. Then I throw some more rules at you. When the object is a square, press with your left hand, and if it is a triangle, press with your right hand. Uh-oh, now you have a problem. If you see a blue triangle or a red square, what should you do? The color rules are telling you to press one way and the shape rules the other. These simple rules, mapping stimulus to response, are now overlapping. There is competition between the pathways. You will need to add some additional information to distinguish when to use the color rules and when to use the shape rules. For example, I might instruct you that when the object is small, do the color task, but when it is large, do the shape task. We have added a hierarchical level to your task structure, making the decision tree deeper. Analogous to the role that an indoor or outdoor context plays in a child's decision about whether to shout, size, in this example, is an abstract contextual feature. It does not provide a context for how to respond directly. Rather, it instructs how to relate other features of your environment, colors or shapes, to your response. As this task gets more complex, I can continue to add more contexts and more branch points on my rule tree. For example, say you come back to my lab the next day. Today, I tell you that you should decide whether to do the color or shape task, depending on the position of the object on the screen, rather than its size. Specifically, when the object appears on top, do the shape task, and when it appears on the bottom, do the color task. The tree has been made deeper by another step. You now have two second-order rule trees. One uses size to determine the rule set, and the other uses location. To keep these separate, you need a new superordinate context that can distinguish which subordinate context, size or location, is relevant right now. In this example, that superordinate context is actually the day or episode when you are doing the task. During this episode, you are using location to choose your task. If I changed back to size as the subordinate context later in the visit, you would need to keep track of that change in episode again. Well, that escalated quickly. We started with a couple simple stimulus response rules. These are sometimes termed first-order policies because they express a direct relationship between a stimulus feature, like the color red, and an action, like press right. But as new rules were learned, the overlap and competition among policies grew. To reduce this overlap, it was necessary to build increasingly higher-order policies based on new contextual elements. Each time we added a context, the rule tree got deeper with a new branch point. In a couple steps, your task was represented by a third-order policy, in which an episode determines whether size or location determines whether color or shape determines the button to press. Trees are an efficient way to represent hard problems. As we add levels to this tree, the number of relationships between states in the world and the behaviors they entail that we can accommodate grows exponentially. This description of these relationships is far more compact and efficient than if we had simply created a list of all those combinations of episode, size, location, shape, color, and response one by one, sometimes called a lookup table. As a decision tree, our lookup table would be a very wide, flat tree with as many branches as we have combinations of features and responses. That is a lot of options to choose from, and each branch has to be learned on its own. Instead, if we can behave according to third-order policy, we are effectively solving this hard problem using only a few decision points. Using hierarchies as a way of structuring behavior has big payoffs. Given the advantages of a decision tree, humans are able to behave according to the rules of third-order policy, and even deeper ones. But there are costs to offset the advantages. As these trees get deeper, people have to keep track of more contextual features, and they have to relate them to one another hierarchically. With deeper rule trees, people's response times get slower, and they start making more errors. Despite these costs in performance, however, there is considerable evidence that humans leverage the hierarchical structure of a task to control their behavior. Indeed, they will attempt to find these tree-like hierarchical rules when they enter a new task. A few years ago, I conducted an experiment in collaboration with neurologists and cognitive neuroscientists Andy Kaiser and Mark Desposito that tested people's ability to discover and apply hierarchical structures in a new environment. The experiment was similar to the hypothetical version I just described, except that we didn't tell people the rules. Rather, our participants had to figure out the rules based only on feedback they received about whether their responses were correct or not. In this experiment, people were shown a series of stimulus displays, each of which consisted of a shape appearing at a particular orientation, up, down, or diagonal, and surrounded by a colored box. They were told that, depending on the specific display, pressing one of 3 buttons on a keypad would earn them a small amount of money. However, it was up to them to figure out the right button to press, given the particular display. They would be told after every response whether they had earned money or not. On the basis of this feedback, They could learn the mapping between each combination of color, shape, and orientation and a correct response. Across all the displays, there were 3 shapes, 3 orientations, and 2 colors. So, in total, there were 18 unique combinations of these 3 features mapping to 3 possible responses. Learning which response maps to each of these 18 stimulus displays based only on feedback is a challenging learning problem. However, without telling our participants, we set up a higher-order hierarchical structure among the mappings. For example, whenever the color in the display was red, then the shape of the object cued the response. And when it was blue, orientation cued the response. Thus, if participants could figure out this hierarchical structure, the learning problem became much easier. Rather than learning all 18 individual rules, they could learn one higher-order rule that mapped color to either shape or orientation. Then, they needed to figure out only the 3 rules for each of these, and they were set. They had a compact, hierarchical version of the 18 rules. Importantly, we didn't tell our participants any of this. Indeed, we even included a control version of the experiment in which no such hierarchical structure existed. In this case, each conjunction of shape, color, and orientation mapped uniquely to one of the responses. So the people would need to learn all 18 unique mappings individually. We called this the flat rule because there was no hierarchical structure. The instructions, setup, and look and feel of the learning session were kept identical between flat and hierarchical conditions. The only difference was the hidden hierarchical rule structure in one of the conditions. Despite these controls, people were able to discover the hierarchical rule when it was there, and they used it to greatly improve their performance in the hierarchical relative to the flat condition. Moreover, people discovered this hierarchical structure early on in their learning. In the flat condition, by contrast, people learned slowly and were never able to figure out all 18 rules. In follow-up work with Michael Frank using mathematical modeling, we found that people's rapid discovery of the hierarchical structure occurred because they were actively looking for this structure from the outset of the experiment. Conversely, it was only after a hierarchical structure failed repeatedly that they tried to learn each conjunction rule on its own. Indeed, in subsequent work by Michael Frank and Ann Collins, people would learn a hierarchical structure even when it conferred no advantage over a flat structure. So, confronted with an unfamiliar problem, people can rapidly discover and apply a hierarchical rule structure if it is present to be learned. Why do people look for hierarchical structure even when there is no particular advantage to doing so? The answer is that people are implicitly investing in the future. Hierarchical structures include abstractions that can be more readily generalized to new tasks. If color was useful as a higher-order context in one setting, it would be easy to transfer this to a new setting where it determined whether location and size was relevant instead of shape and orientation. Hierarchical structures are also compositional, as each branching of a tree includes a subtree that can be removed from the whole and glued onto the tree structure of a new task. Thus, even if a hierarchical rule is not particularly useful right now, it is likely to be more useful in the future than a flat rule. Indeed, the participants in Ann and Michael's experiment who used a hierarchical structure were able to readily transfer this rule to a new task. Their bet paid off after all. To summarize then, we spontaneously build hierarchical rules to structure our action control in complex environments. These trees are useful because they allow us to keep episodes, rules, and tasks separate that might otherwise compete. They also let us efficiently store rules that solve hard problems. And by adding higher, more abstract contexts to our rule structures, we are able to recombine, swap, and remove lower branches without changing the whole structure of a task. In other words, they are inherently compositional. Thus, hierarchical representations are likely a big piece of the answer to how we readily act to achieve our goals in new, complex environments. As we will see in the next section, working memory gating mechanisms are central to making use of hierarchical structures like these. Mechanisms of hierarchical control. Let's return to the basic working memory gating framework we introduced in Chapter 3, but now using the example of the hierarchical indoor voice rule. For my boys to implement the indoor voice rule, they will need to gate the context indoor into working memory at the appropriate moment. Then, when the urge strikes one of them to tell his brother something really exciting, he will need to output gate that context to overcome his tendency to shout, tempering his enthusiasm based on his context. These gates can be operated by disinhibitory loops between the cortex, the basal ganglia, and the thalamus that amplify the right context in working memory at the right time. Some elaboration of this basic framework can also explain the more complex hierarchical version of this rule. In this version, the context parent needs to influence the use of indoors as a context, as opposed to influencing speaking directly. However, it turns out there are multiple ways to elaborate our basic control system to solve a problem like this, and each has its own advantages and disadvantages. For example, one way to do this would be to lump all the contexts together into working memory and use their conjunction for responding. In other words, we would create new contexts from every combination of parents being there or not, and indoor or outdoor. So you would learn that when you have the conjunction, parent and indoor, in working memory, you speak in a soft voice. If parent and outdoor, you can be loud, and so forth. Consider what a CDM model might look like that takes this approach. This version has a larger context layer to include all the possible contexts, and each unique conjunction of contexts has its own pathways to a particular response. Wired correctly, this model will follow the more complex rule, but it has some serious disadvantages. We had to grow the size of the task demand and hidden layers in the original model to accommodate these new pathways. All these added connections will make the whole architecture a bit harder to learn, as each separate pathway needs to be wired properly, so the model needs more experience with every conjunction to link all these new contexts with the right behavior. Beyond the time this takes, the model is limited to the pathways we have taught it. For example, the model would be unable to benefit from its prior knowledge if we added a new indoor rule like walking rather than running when inside the house. To add this new bit, we would need to map all our various conjunctions of parent and indoor/outdoor to this new rule. This is a cumbersome way to go about doing things. If our brain worked this way, our life would be spent learning every individual conjunction of contexts and the behaviors that follow from them. We would have little ability to generalize or transfer outside of the conjunctions we had learned. This solution would quickly fall afoul of the scaling problem we discussed in Chapter 1. Part of the issue with this solution to hierarchical control is that it has sacrificed the hierarchical structure inherent in the original rule. By relying on conjunctions of contexts, we have effectively flattened the whole rule structure, and so there are no higher or lower order contexts or compositional constituents. To take advantage of this structure, we need a way to modify our model so that we preserve the hierarchical structure in the rule. The original CDM had a context provide an input to sensory motor pathways that select a response. So, maintaining the context indoor rules would affect the mapping between a stimulus and a response to favor a soft voice. Our modified model adds a new context layer for the presence of a parent that influences whether being inside the house maps to the context indoor rules or not. In other words, we use the same structure that CDM did originally, but rather than using a context to select a response pathway, we now also have a context that selects another context. We have simply added a second CDM model nested onto the first one. Separating our contextual control in this way preserves the hierarchical structure of the task in the nested scheme. As a result, it can do the kind of transfer and generalization that the toy model cannot. For example, we can add new rules to the class of indoor rules, like running versus walking, without having to relearn the relevance of a parent's presence. Anything attached to the indoor rule just inherits this relationship. While this scheme has many advantages, it is also clear that this structure adds some serious demands on our working memory gating mechanisms. We now have two context layers, and so if we want to control these separately, we will need more gates associated with each. These gates need to be coordinated with respect to each other to produce the correct response at the right time. Thus, implementing a hierarchical rule places correspondingly high demands on working memory gating. How are these multiple gates supported in the brain? In our investigation of the hierarchical learning task described previously, Michael Frank and I addressed this problem in a neural network model. Just as in the simpler cases we described in Chapter 3, hierarchical gating can be supported by the corticobasal ganglia circuit. We have already seen how a cortical striatal thalamic loop can implement an output gate for a context maintained in working memory. Activation of a neural representation in cortex of a useful context leads to the GO neurons in the striatum amplifying this neural representation via palatal disinhibition of the thalamus. In this way, at a particular moment, a context like indoors is gated and used to select the response policy, speak softly. To add the higher order context, we add a separate loop that output gates the context parent. Thus, the prefrontal cortex maintains both the context indoor and the context parent separately from each other. Corresponding separate corticostriatal loops independently learn when to output gate these contexts. Importantly, these separate loops are nested and interact hierarchically. Specifically, the output from the cortex of the superordinate loop projects to the striatal gate of the subordinate loop. This input is labeled as a diagonal connection. When the superordinate context parent is output gated by its striatal gate, it provides a contextual input through the diagonal connection to the go and no-go cells, considering whether to output gate the subordinate context indoor. When they receive that input, they are more likely to vote to output gate the indoor context. In this way, a hierarchical rule is implemented by separate, nested corticostriatal gates. There is growing evidence that this hypothetical nested looping architecture may hit close to the mark in terms of how the brain implements hierarchical rules. In Chapter 2, we saw that humans are distinguished from other primates, and even other great apes like the chimpanzee, by our greatly expanded prefrontal cortex. These expansions appear to follow a roughly back-to-front progression. Anatomists refer to brain structures toward the front as rostral, from the Latin word rostrum, meaning beak, and the structures toward the back as caudal, from the Latin word cauda, meaning tail. So these differences from the beak to tail of the frontal lobes are often referred to as the rostrocaudal organization of frontal cortex. A number of trends follow this rostrocaudal organization. Neuron density increases toward the front of the brain, and there is higher connectedness among the neurons themselves, potentially reflecting more integrative and abstract neural representations. Further, as introduced in Chapter 2, the pattern of connectivity shifts from long-range connections and toward local connections rostrally within the frontal lobe. Thus, the overall organization resembles a hierarchical architecture, with rostral regions featuring more integrative cortical representations that exert their influence primarily on other caudal frontal regions, rather than directly on posterior cortical networks. Further, in the last decade, more direct evidence has indicated that this rostrocaudal organization is important as people engage in hierarchical control. Neuroimaging studies in humans from our lab and others have provided consistent evidence that as people perform higher-order rules with deeper decision trees, they engage regions that are further rostral in the lateral prefrontal cortex. Patients with damage to the more rostral areas of the frontal lobe show more performance deficits on deeper rule trees than on shallower ones. Conversely, patients with damage more caudally in frontal cortex exhibit deficits with both shallow and deep trees. In more recent work in healthy volunteers, Derek Nee and Mark Desposito showed that stimulating different regions of the prefrontal cortex using transcranial magnetic stimulation also produced a hierarchical pattern of deficits. In the decade and a half since these initial observations, considerable work to deepen our understanding of how prefrontal cortex is organized to support hierarchical cognitive control has resulted in several important refinements to the idea that deeper hierarchies are controlled by more rostral prefrontal cortex. First, though, there is a qualitative rostrocaudal functional organization that is crucial to hierarchical tasks. There is no single functional gradient of abstraction that encompasses the entire frontal lobe. The term functional gradient implies there is one axis of abstraction that defines the organization of the frontal lobe in step increments. But it is not the case that one can start at the motor cortex with control over the simplest concrete actions and, in a stepwise neuron-by-neuron way, get progressively abstract actions represented in neurons moving forward to the rostral pole of the frontal lobe. Rather, the different regions identified in fMRI studies are actually members of broader distributed networks between frontal and parietal cortex association areas that are active with increasing hierarchical levels. Indeed, these are subnetworks of the broader frontoparietal control system discussed in Chapter 3. As a consequence, though large components of these networks in prefrontal cortex follow a caudal to rostral progression, there are also exceptions to this pattern. Thus, one can better predict how regions will participate in hierarchical control based on their network relationships rather than on their rostro to caudal location. Second, the top of the hierarchy is not actually the network that includes the most rostral prefrontal area, the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex, which was initially considered to be the top of the frontal lobe hierarchy. It was hypothesized to be the place where the most abstract contexts that prevailed over the longest periods of time were maintained. This idea has proved to be only partially correct. One clue to the ranking of a particular brain region within a frontal lobe hierarchy is its asymmetric pattern of connection with other regions. Think of hierarchies as they exist elsewhere in the world. In a corporation, for example, the decisions of a CEO greatly affect all employees. but the decisions of the mailroom attendant minimally affect the CEO. Superordinate regions, those higher up in the hierarchy, should influence those below them, rather than vice versa. If influence is expressed in a brain as strength of connection, this predicts an asymmetry of greater output rather than input from a brain region higher up in the hierarchy. Anatomical studies conducted in the monkey brain and studies of functional connectivity in the human brain have used this definition to rank regions in the frontal lobe hierarchy, with outcomes remarkably consistent across species. In moving from caudal to rostral frontal cortex, the output-to-input ratio grows, consistent with increasingly higher hierarchical rank. But this pattern reaches its peak not in rostrolateral prefrontal cortex, but just behind it, in the mid-dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is roughly the same region we noted earlier is expanded in humans relative to other species. It also matures latest in development. If it isn't the top of the hierarchy, what role does the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex and its associated network play in hierarchical cognitive control? Unlike the anterior dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, rostrolateral prefrontal cortex is a major zone of input to prefrontal cortex. Indeed, the study cited earlier found that its output-to-input ratio is reversed, such that its degree of input is higher than the output. Its output is primarily to the frontal lobe, specifically the mid-dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. However, its inputs notably come from the network of areas, including the hippocampus and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that we associated with our long-term knowledge of the world and episodic future thought in Chapter 2. Further, as we saw earlier in the study of sequential control by Teresa DeRochers, rostrolateral prefrontal cortex is active during tasks that require engaging in control, based not just on our current situation, but on what has happened in the past and what might happen in the future. These are important clues toward the role of this region. In a review of the literature on the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex, David Nee and I hypothesized that the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex may be one critical interface between our systems for episodic future thought and cognitive control. It may provide a way of holding in mind information about our explicit internal model of the world and the hypothetical futures and paths we can take. As such, rostrolateral prefrontal cortex is crucial for bringing our knowledge of the past, present, and future to bear on control systems. To summarize, then, the first requirement for a nested hierarchical control architecture is evident in the brain. There are separable sub-networks that could support control over different hierarchical levels. They are organized such that the simplest rules are supported by networks, including areas like premotor cortex that are caudal in the frontal lobe and are close to motor cortex. More rostral networks, which include the mid-dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, may be important for control involving more abstract higher-order policies. Thus, these separate cortical networks can process different contexts, like parent or indoor, for gating by different striatal loops. Importantly, however, this is only part of our hypothesis. The model also predicts that these different cortical networks should be coordinated by separate nested striatal gates. There is also evidence for this organization. Anatomical studies in the non-human primate have long established a rostral-caudal organization of cortico-striatal thalamic loops. Further, even within the connections from the DLPFC to striatum, there is a fine-grained, ordered rostrocaudal organization of connections. These organized inputs are a basis for each area of prefrontal cortex to be regulated by its own separate corticostriatal thalamic feedback loop. This interpretation is further supported by fMRI studies that observe greater communication between specific segments of the striatum and prefrontal cortex, depending on the depth of a rule tree being used during hierarchical control. Studies of white matter tracts have also found that not all the terminations follow the general rostrocaudal pattern of connections. These are divergent connections that don't follow the systematic caudal to rostral gradient that most connections do. Interestingly, there is an asymmetry in the pattern of these divergent connections. Inputs originating in rostral frontal regions that project back to caudal striatal areas are more likely to diverge than vice versa. This means that neurons in rostral prefrontal cortex will broadcast their contextual signal to caudal striatum more than the other way around. This is likely an important anatomical feature for hierarchical gating. Recall that the rostral prefrontal cortex also is maintaining the more abstract contextual information and goals. Thus, the caudal corticostriatal loops are being influenced by the context maintained in rostral prefrontal cortex, more than the other way around. When a rostral loop output gates an abstract context, like parent, it provides a strong input to the caudal loop that can output gate a lower order context like indoor. These were the diagonal connections noted earlier. The opposite influence does not happen to the same degree. In summary, when we need to implement a hierarchical rule that involves multiple contexts influencing one another, we can do so by coordinating multiple input and output gates on working memory. Each gate regulates working memory for a task context at a particular level of the tree. When a higher level context is output, it influences the gating operation by a lower level gate, and so forth. These gating operations are implemented in the brain by a series of nested corticostriatal thalamic loops that coordinate the influence of separate networks on each other, such that more rostral networks tend to influence the gating operation of caudal networks. These interactive gating dynamics allow the network to engage in control based on deep rule trees that solve hard hierarchical problems. Most of the tasks we do and goals we wish to accomplish are complicated. When I look for coffee at the hotel, it involves lots of different sub-goals operating over different timescales or multiple contextual elements that constrain one another in complex ways. As we borrow and generalize, the components of action overlap and interfere with each other and need contextual support to move forward smoothly. The ability to represent problems hierarchically is a powerful solution to this problem. However, implementing these hierarchical rules is a challenge. To confront the challenge of implementing hierarchical rules, the brain can leverage the working memory gating system discussed in Chapter 3. By nesting multiple corticostriatal gating loops ordered back to front in the frontal lobe, the brain can solve gating problems for deeper rule trees, and we can learn and generalize our gating policies to new situations by learning about each gating policy separately. I can update my decision to wait in line at a coffee shop separately from my overall goal of having a cup of coffee. If they are influencing my behavior, each of these levels of abstraction is processed through separate gating loops between the frontal cortex and the striatum. Thus, a major consequence of the elaboration and growth of the frontal lobes in human evolution may have been an increased capacity for this kind of higher-order gating. As we elaborated the gating system, we could manage increasingly deeper rule trees. As already noted, small increases in our ability to manage a rule tree can yield large gains in the kinds of behavioral problems that can be solved. Thus, Small changes in the brain's ability to gate working memory would have yielded major changes in our capacity to get things done.